So there were several interesting findings. Two, again, that I just explained, but I think are very important, are that before a new word is read, they show that the brain activity is well predicted by the latent representation in the neural network. That's representing the context. And after the word is read, again, the correlation still holds with the prediction of the word. This is the last paper that I'm going to try to explain before I get to the other part of the talk. This is a 2004 +1 paper by the same group, essentially, Leila Wahbi and Tom Mitchell. And here they try to predict activity. It's not really stories, it's passages of Harry Potter. And the paradigm that they have is that inside the fMRI, every word is presented half a second apart. So they see Harry had never believed within 2 seconds. Okay? And it takes 2 seconds to get an fMRI image. So within each fMRI image, you have 4 words. Okay? And the activity the activity in the fMRI approximately lasts for about 8 seconds. So in their predictive model, they basically used predicted activity from 4 time points before in order to predict the last time point. And the features that they had were discourse features, visual features, syntactic features. So whatever they can get from the story was included as part of the features that went into the analysis. And essentially, it was a combination of all these features, and they included these features throughout time, so through 4 time points before, and they were able to make predictions about passages. So these were the type of passages, 16 words, and they were able to achieve 74% accuracy. They also did searchlight analysis, which is interesting. So for every voxel in the brain, every 5 by 5 voxel in the brain, they used one of the features out of all the features that that were listed in the previous slide to see whether that feature is predictive of the activity of that voxel. Okay, and they did this for the whole brain.
What does this 74% accuracy mean?
It means that good question. So it means that if they, I'm going to explain this method when I'm explaining our study, but very high level. So if they predict one particular activity, right, and they have 2 different segments, so they make 2 different predictions, and they have the real activity, right? And if the distance between the real activity, the predictive activity of the 2 are greater than the distance of the other combination. Does that make sense?
So is the non-real one is randomly drawn usually?
What do you mean?
You said that the 2 things you're comparing to versus the predicted thing, right? One thing is the true thing, and the other thing is the not true thing.
No, so it's the other one. So there are 2 stories that are 2 passages that are left out.
Oh, 2 passages.
Right?
Gotcha.
So it's the predictive, the passage, yeah, right, and then the other 2. There are 2 passages. Okay. Does that make sense?
Yeah. And all the previous stuff, was that always binary classification?
It's usually binary classification.
Okay.
Yeah.
Like tools versus animals.
Exactly.
Okay.
Right.
Not 1 for 4.
Right. Right. And it's usually classification, right? Generally. So does the searchlight analysis make sense, though? So they move around the brain, every voxel, and they try to do, out of all the features that they had in their analysis, which one is predictive of that story at that time. Okay? And they get something like this. Again, some of this makes sense. So for visual, we have the occipital lobe, right? For syntax, we have part of language areas that are known to be related to syntax, etc. Okay? There have also been work looking at interlanguage decoding. So if we have bilingual participants, right? If we know the neural activity for one language, can we predict the neural activity in the other language? Okay? So in this particular experiment, they had Dutch and English, and they were they read names of animals in 2 different language, in either Dutch or English. Okay? And again, they were able to do this. They were able to make these predictions across both within language predictions and across language prediction. And the activity that they find is in the region that's in the anterior temporal lobe that the 1996 Damasio paper doing lesion studies indicated that this might actually be a semantic hub. So, cool. All right, so now I'm going to talk about our work. Our work is on neurosemantic representations of stories. The general goal is to see whether we can, so the general goal is to investigate the neural representations of narratives across 3 different languages. There are 2 main questions that we try to answer. One, are there predictable patterns in neurosemantic representations of narratives? And if so, can these predictable patterns be used to distinguish narratives based on fMRI data? The second question is that, is there similarity in patterns of neural activity across languages? So if we know the activity in English, and if we have the semantic representation of the stories in Chinese, can we make this prediction? Okay? So the story selection process, this was actually, the stories were picked as part of a DARPA project where we were interested in moral stories. So we used Andrew's story upgrade system to search over 20 million stories. We coded a number of these stories for various factors, for example, evocativeness, for type of values, type of framing that was involved. Out of all those, we chose 100 narratives. We shortened the narratives to 145 to 150 words. Then we did an extensive behavioral piloting on these, again, to make sure that we were getting a representative sample. So, for example, we had how strongly did you react to this story? Again, what type of frames were involved, what types of values were involved in this story. And out of the 100, we finally chose 40 stories. These 40 stories were translated to Farsi and to Mandarin by professional translators.
So, what was the criterion for selecting the 40?
There were various, so we wanted a balanced set of stories based on how evocative they were, based on the type of values that they were showing. We specifically wanted stories that included some aspect of morality in them. Okay? And the behavioral experiment was done to make sure that we're covering a general range of moral stories, not all, for example, focused on harm or fairness, etc. So, once they were translated, we back-translated the stories into English, and they were verified by 2 RAs that they have the same context, they have the same meaning, and each sentence essentially is giving the same type of information. This is the experimental timeline. The stories are all in first-person perspective, so we first had to provide the context. So I think Nima did the experiment, right? Yeah. So they would first see the context. Here would be American Mother. Then they would read the story. Then they would answer the question. We're not concerned with the context or the question in this project. This was functional fMRI. We had 30 American subjects who read the stories in English, 30 Chinese who read the stories in Mandarin, and 30 Iranians who read the stories in Farsi. So 90 subjects total. There was extensive pre-processing done on the data. This is very general when we do fMRI analysis. I'm not going to talk about it. What we need to know for this project, again, is that essentially for each story, for each participant, we get a statistical map. Standard z-score for each story, again, for each participant, representing the brain activity when participant is reading that story compared to rest. Okay? So when they're not doing anything and when they're reading that story. Cool? All right. For the stories, we're just using Word2Vec pretty much, and you guys know about more about Word2Vec than I do, so I'm just going to skip this. For training Word2Vec, for English, it was pretty easy. These are, again, all corpora that were gathered by Andrew. Andrew's 20 million personal stories were used for training the English vectors, and this is a very representative training corpus. It has been used previously in other NLP tasks. For Farsi, we initially trained the corpus, we initially trained the vectors on a corpus of 1.2 gigabyte of blog posts. This resulted in very bad performance, and we realized that the stories were actually in formal Farsi, and the blog posts were mostly in informal Farsi, right? So we added a corpus of Farsi newspaper articles to try to compensate for that. And so we also had formal Farsi, but still not a lot of stories.
Given the fact that you had so few stories overall, I would assume that there would be very low out of vocabulary word in the stories versus the training set. Is that true?
That's true.
Was every word seen?
I don't know whether every word was seen or not. But these are big corpora, so we have very little stories, right?
Fairly generic-ish.
Fairly generic, right?
Didn't you try to use like literature, like fables, things like that, that we translated in different languages?
We could have, but again, for Farsi that might not have been representative as well because, for example, the type of fiction that you're talking about, novels, are a pretty new
I
category.
was thinking like Aesop fables, like really classic fables, type of things.
Right, but
Those
again,
would be-
again,
maybe
those
not
wouldn't be
corpus.
representative either because the original language was not Farsi, right? So we wanted a really representative corpus. But yes, I mean, these are all things that we can do. And for Chinese, same thing, corpus of blog posts from Sina, gathered by Andrew. So again, study one, first question, can we tell which story the participants were reading based on their brain activity? So if we have the brain activity,
You said we're all familiar with word, right? Okay, but the paragraph
Document.
vector, is that just the sum over the word vectors of that paragraph, or?
more or less, but it basically gives you a vector representation of a paragraph in similar manner. Okay? So for the first task, we have the fMRI activity of each participant for each story, and we wanted, based on that fMRI activity, to be able to tell which story they were reading. Okay? So for each participant, again, for each story, we have a vector of 212,000. These are the number of voxels that we're analyzing, and each V here is basically giving us the activity of that voxel while that participant was reading the story compared to rest. And then we have 40 of these, right? We have 40 stories, and we have 30 participants per culture.
But fMRI goes in time, or is that slices of?
It's slices and we're summing up. So we're summing it up
So
for,
just sum up all the
Right.
fMRIs in both.
we're looking at the
minutes or
average
1 minute.
over that period of time that people were reading the story. And we have the vector representation of the story, so we have 40 of those per culture, right? And this is essentially what we're trying to do. So we're trying to find a mapping between the fMRI vector and the story vector, right? So the second question is, can we do this cross-lingually? So if we have the American activity, if you have the fMRI of an American reading the story, can we take the semantic representation of the stories in Farsi and make the prediction? Same thing with Chinese, and same thing if we have, for example, the fMRI of an Iranian, can we do the same thing?
So what's the significance of that? I mean, is it
The
just
significance of that would be whether there are patterns that are shared, whether there are neuro-semantic patterns that are shared across languages.
wouldn't be that just dependent on the word length for both languages?
It would, but not just on that, on the fMRI activity as well. Right?
But to ask this question, wouldn't you have to keep the training corpus for word to die constant across the 3 languages?
If it's capturing some aspects of the semantic, right, and we're only interested in that, we can't keep it constant for the 3 languages,
I know you can't, but
right?
can you ask this question?
But what we can do is that we can keep it constant while we change the fMRI vector. So for Americans, right, when we're decoding the Dr. vectors in English, we look at the fMRI in English, the fMRI of Americans, the fMRI of Iranians, and the fMRI of the Chinese.
Got it.
right? So we are doing that in a sense, right?
I don't know if it's the same question. Can you predict from the paragraph vector of the English story which one of these is the translation?
Oh, no, we haven't tried that. That's a good question. So just going from between the paragraph vectors,
Yeah.
whether there's a correspondence between, yes, that's a very good question. We haven't tried that.
Do you have to also maybe have like a validation set of people to also test, not necessarily like this train? I don't
What do you mean? So have bilinguals read them? Okay, and you know, these are our cards, and this is the data that we have, and we have to play with the cards that we have. So yes, of course, there's a lot more things that we can do, but just take into account that each of these fMRIs costs about $2,000, right? So we can't just throw in like 100 other people to do this.
One person, one story, $2,000?
No, one person, 40 stories, $2,000, right?
And the rest of the state, right?
Yeah, right. So again, cross-lingual, if we have the fMRI of culture C, can we predict fMRI of the story in language not C? So in a task like this, which is often referred to as multi-voxel pattern analysis, we get a classic classification setting, right? So here we have voxels, but these are really our features, right? So we have these features. The weight of the features are the degree of activity, and the set of these features are the brain patterns for when the participant is looking at that particular category. So this goes back to John's comments, right? These are cat versus dog, right? Shelter versus tool. And then we have a training set, and we make a classifier and then test it on the test sets. Okay? Our setting is different. For each participant, we have 40 vectors, right? And we basically want to go from these vectors, from the fMRI vectors into these vectors, right? So we use multivariate ridge regression to fit the data, and we learn a separate multivariate regression for each participant. So we model on 38 stories, test on 39. So essentially we do 780 analysis per subject, right? And this is the criteria that Nima asked about. So we have the predicted story 39, the actual story 39, plus the distance between predicted story 40, actual story 40. If this is greater than 39, 40, 40, 39, then we say yes. Okay? And then we average over 700, 780 rounds. Okay? And then for the cross-lingual classification is the same idea. So we have the fMRIs and the vectors in a different language. We also had 40 random vectors, random story vectors. These are vectors with the same variance and same mean as the story vectors, but they were just random. Okay, to take as baseline. So for the random vectors, we get chance, we get 50%. And this is the result for the other one. So we have a main effect for Americans and English, and this could be because our corpus is more representative. But generally,
What tasking?
what do you mean what tasking? This is the chance. This is going from the fMRI vectors to predict the story. It's, well, the blue, no. So this is the Americans with English. This is the Americans with Farsi vectors. This is the Americans with Chinese, Americans with random vectors. Okay?
And so the Americans for sure all spoke English, right? And
Yeah.
the Chinese all spoke Chinese, right?
Yeah.
And did the Iranians and Chinese speak English?
Yes.
And did any of the Americans speak Farsi or English?
No.
And did any of the Farsis, the Iranians?
No,
and
no,
Chinese
you're absolutely
speak
right. Yeah, I got the point. Yeah.
So, okay, so everybody speaks English and the Iranians and Chinese are only other languages. And yet the Americans do pretty well in Chinese.
Yes.
But and again, you're measuring the ability, you take all the pairs, but essentially you measure the ability to distinguish between two not choose a story among the 40 or whatever.
Right, yeah, so, but we do that for every pair of two stories.
Right.
Yeah, so that's why I say that chance level is 50.
Do you drill a little bit more into this? I mean, is it possible that, for example, there is no semantic signal, but maybe, let's say, you do very well on these tasks for stories that have disturbing emotional content and happy emotional content, and
I get the point. We
that's
did a little bit of that, right? I think we looked at, no, I'm looking at Rayhan. We did look at content, right? And try to see if we have different categories of these. So I think what we did was this. We basically tried to see if there are stories that are very different from each other. Okay, so stories that, because one of the issues is, yes, we're predicting better than chance, and this is great even though the stories are very similar to each other. So we don't have stories about cats and dogs and running on the beach, right? These are all moral stories. The stories are very similar to each other. But so it makes the task harder. What we did do was that we tried to see if we can find stories based on the paragraph vectors that are distant from each other, and whether the accuracy would differ on those, and it didn't.
So this is really cool, but I'm sort of struggling with figuring out what this means. I mean, so what you're seeing, what the results show is that there's some universal localized activity that you pick up in the fMRIs across different cultures and, sort of repeated in these stories. And so to some extent that's cool, but it's sort of not surprising. So is there something else that you get out of this that...
So it is cool, but it is also surprising. I mean, it's
so why
it's
is it
novel
surprising?
Because none of the previous work have actually shown. They have shown that, for example, activity. I'm going to talk about this. That activity in certain parts of the brain represent abstract representation of meaning. Are responsible for abstract representation of meaning. Okay, but no one has actually took those patterns of activity and decoded what story people were reading. We're doing that here.
Can you explain again, like, what does it mean when an American reads a Farsi story?
American does not read a Farsi
What does
story.
it mean? I can't really decode your result.
So, we have the brain activity
The American.
of an American, semantic representation of the story in Farsi. Okay? The stories are the same.
Semantic representation is what?
What is that?
Yes. Right?
But not trained in any way to make them correspond. So the word to vex for the vectors for Farsi, English, and Chinese are all trained independently. So they're
Exactly.
not
Yeah, but-
intended to be multilingual in any way.
But
Right,
the
but when we-
regression, the
how-
fancy regression that you do is particular for each of these conditions.
Exactly.
So there is that effect.
Sorry?
That implies you could show that you could normalize the English to the Farsi potentially somehow, which other book has shown.
I think what it shows is that there is a correlation between semantic representation in Farsi and semantic representation in English of the same story.
Right.
And if there is a correlation from fMRI to English, then of course you should also see dependence from fMRI to Farsi. But by itself, I don't see that
So
the reason
that's,
is-
yes, so that is one thing, right? But we're also showing that the patterns, how the brain is, so you're talking about from the NLP side, that they're showing that there is some correspondence between these paragraph vectors, right? But there's the same thing on the brain level, and we're showing how people are representing these stories. They're across these different languages. There are some
I mean,
commonalities.
look, so fMRI is your input. You
Right.
are trying to predict output, which is your variable y, right?
Mhm.
Now you introduce another variable z, which is a function of y. Can you predict z? Of course, because there is a functional relationship, right? So I don't see I don't see how it says anything more than this. That, there should be some dependency between semantic representation in Farsi and English. But I don't see whether, this argument about something common in the brain representation actually.
So if there is not common fMRI, if there's not something common in the fMRI, if the fMRIs are completely different. So if I'm saying cat and you're hearing dog, right? Would we have been able to do this?
Yeah, I think so. I mean, that's why I asked before, if you establish the story-to-story mapping, then one way to predict the Iranian story would be first predict the English story, and then just use some NLP
Map to map.
vector rotation to get to the Iranian story. So you could predict the Iranian story in 2 steps. But I guess we don't know yet whether that second step is doable.
Right.
But if you could do it in 2 steps just as well, then maybe is that kind
Yeah,
of your point?
exactly. So speak differently. It's possible that for Americans, Iranians, and Chinese, there are different parts of the brains that are activated.
But they're not.
Oh no, but I mean, even if that was true, you could still see correlation between, my fMRI and the Farsi representation. Okay? Because if my activity actually allows to predict English, and the Iranian semantic representation is dependent on English semantic representation, I can still do this prediction basically. But in other words, for each population, you will learn a different predictive model that maps from fMRI to representation.
But how would you why can you do this across the populations?
I mean, I can do cross because the variable that you are asking me to predict is dependent on another variable that I can predict.
Okay.
So there is a dependency, and information theoretically you can definitely learn something.
Right. So one thing that I don't understand is that why can then we do this with the random vectors?
Because in random you cannot predict anything, right? So if fMRI, you have a random label, then of course you cannot do anything. You cannot.
Okay. Well, we can maybe talk about this
Okay.
after. I'm not fully understanding that point, but yeah.
So, I mean, it sounds as if you're making an argument based upon neuroscientific aspects of this,
Right.
is there any way of investigating the actual brain scans themselves and looking, for example, I mean, one thing that springs to mind is how dependent on spatial resolution is the signal that you're pulling out.
Right, and
So
that's
if
what
you-
I'm going to do in the second study.
Oh, okay.
Yeah.
So
In the second study, we're going to actually look at what regions are active across these for these classifications.
And the question I was going to specifically ask is, if you degraded the spatial signal, and then you so you've got all the data, if you degraded the spatial signal and ruined the spatial, and basically distorted it so that kind of merged out all of the, just made your resolution poorer, would that degrade the response? And would that be then helpful to kind of determine how much
That's a good
how
point.
much tightness you need, how much
That's a good
resolution you
point.
need in spatial?
Right. I haven't looked at that. That's a good point.
Particularly correlates. So what have you done like the obvious thing, which is just to here you do this comparison of pairs. Have you done this like here's a fMRI vector, predict one of the 40 as opposed to just all these pairs? What's the
Yeah.
performance if you did that? I mean, this is a Mitchell. I mean, I knew that you did the same thing, but
Right.
I wouldn't tell you why this is.
I think we did it. I don't remember what the performance was. I don't remember. We just followed the same
Because it's easy one to say, okay, here's a Iranian brain. I want to predict the corresponding American story or the corresponding Aussie story. Right? Don't do the comparison, just go directly.
I think the reason they do the way they do it is because they need training data, right? So they don't have a universal regression that does the mapping from one representation to the other. So that's why they do these data splits, and they learn a different regression function for every single instance that they want to test. But I think because you learn a different regression in every single instance, that's where you open yourself to this
Right.
pushback,
Right.
right? That that it's normal when you learn different. Since the different regressions, then
Along the same line, so if you want to show that the same brain regions are responsible in both stories, then you should be able to transfer the model in one culture to the other. Which means
That's what we do in the second study. So, do you want me to move on?
yes.
Okay, so I think we talked about some of these aspects.
Can you show us the two numbers that you just skipped over?
Oh, so we were just testing some other representations of it. So if we do, vanilla LDA with 1,000 other stories and look at the weights of that on these stories, how well do we do just for English, and the same thing with Greek. So in study 2, what we wanted to do was to look at if there are specific brain networks that exactly do what Aram was saying, that are responsible for encoding this information. So previously what we did was that we did a whole brain analysis. So every voxel in the brain was included in the analysis. Here we do searchlight analysis. So we take a voxel and a sphere around it, sphere of radius 4, and we get the activity for that voxel. The activity centered around that voxel, and we try to see if we can do the same sort of regression. Okay? And then we take, again, from that same voxel activity, and we try to predict the story. So similar setting.
Sorry, what's the resolution of your
3 by 3 by 3. The voxels.
How big is each voxel? 1 millimeter?
It's 3 by 3 by 3.
Millimeters.
Yes.
And what's the signal here? I'm sorry. What do you actually get out of the fMRI? Just some continuous activity, some level. I don't really know.
It's blood oxygenation level.
Okay, so you get a level.
Right.
Okay.
Just a quick question between what was answered earlier. You said you just average it over time. Is there a reason for that? Did you try to look at the
Each
slices
passages?
and if there were
It's
and if there was a way to align them to the
right. That's a very good point. That's what we started with, to look at each passage, and we weren't doing well. Okay. But we do it for one voxel. We have to do it for the whole brain, right? So we do the same analysis all over the brain. So we had, again, maybe same issue. For each person, there are these many voxels, and for each voxel, similar to the previous, we do 780. And then we have 30 participants for each culture, and 3 cultures. So it becomes a huge mess, essentially. And then we want to see if there are similarities in these regions across the 3 languages, so we add a factor of 3. So overall, we do around 40 billion regressions. We have to do 40 billion regressions.
Missing a digit?
Yeah, it's not
Is there an extra 0 you're missing?
No. Yeah, right. Right. So this took over a month, and then what we essentially get as a result of regression are accuracy maps for each subject.
How do you know the brains are like, I guess there's a neuroscience technique, but that they are lined up and you're measuring.
We map them into the same space. So that's part of the pre-processing. They're all mapped into the same space. Okay?
And that's a standard technique.
That's a standard technique. That's why I didn't go over the pre-processing. It's all standard from there. So we do non-parametric permutation tests to get a T-map. We do multiple comparison correction. And then we threshold at P of 05 to basically get a map for every voxel, whether that particular voxel had significant predictive power compared to others. So we get something like this for within language analysis. This is for, again, Americans to English, Chinese to Mandarin, and Iranians to Farsi. As you can see, there are a lot of similarities. This is completely expected. So we get activity in the prefrontal cortex, we get activity in the temporal lobe and some other parts of the brain. And if we do the between language analysis, similar parts of the brain, you see a general pattern across these analyses. And what this network is, it's the default mode network. So this is a network that is well known. Go ahead.
How did you get those pictures? Like, at no point were Chinese speakers reading Farsi, so.
So these were the Chinese fMRIs tested on what did you say, Farsi representation of the stories. Okay. So this is the default mode network. The default mode network is pretty hot these days. There are 3 major subdivisions, and these are the subdivisions that are active, that are most predictive in our analysis. So if we divide the functions of the brain into these several different maps, you can see that, for example, the auditory, sensomotor, visual, and the default mode, and the rest of them are completely different. Specifically, the default mode network is very different from the other networks. The default mode network is active.
Can we go back to slides? I didn't quite understand. One more slide. what I can see here. I mean, does this something say about the culture of Chinese versus Farsi?
We're not investigating the culture.
Like, but does it say anything? What can I take away from this picture?
It's what you can take away from these maps are that there are similar patterns of activity.
Actually, how dissimilar it doesn't matter. So the Americans have felt more connected kind of reading
Right.
activity, while the Chinese and the Farsi
Yes, they're not exactly the
different.
same, and you can't expect the same exact map across people. You find, if you actually look at the overlap between these, the pattern that it emerges is very much similar to the activity of the default mode network. And the default mode network, so you have to look at the maps, the areas that are most yellow in these, okay? So those are the most predictive.
should I care about the areas that are not yellow, so the Americans have a connection between two sides and it's only
There could be, yes,
Is that
and
significant or is not?
this is what you get with fMRI. fMRI is not precise, right?
So, I'm not a scientist.
So what similar, different cultures, we all have a similar brain activity working. Is that what I'm looking at too?
Pretty much. So
Yeah.
when we're reading these stories, they're
Yeah.
similar activities. Okay. So fMRI, especially when fMRI has a bad temporal resolution, right? And for no fMRI experiment, you can get specific locations, right? So these are generally maps that are distributed across the brain. And then what you do is that you look at the commonalities across them. And the commonality here is the default mode network. Okay? So the default mode network is active when people are not focused on the outside world, and they're either wakefully resting or they're active in internally directed social processes. So for example, when they're recalling personal memories, they're imagining the future, they have their social emotions that are involved, social evaluations, etc. Okay? There have been also a lot of work showing that the DMN is involved in reading and comprehending stories.
Do you know if the sensory cortices are active during?
The DMN? No.
No.
So if it was like a news report, you might not expect the DMN to be on, the idea?
If you're reading about an outside event, then you don't expect the DMN to be involved, right? But if it's involved some introspection, right? If it involves some social processing that involves you, right? Then you expect the DMN to be involved.
So the type of story might influence whether or not the DMN is involved.
The type of story might be, yes, the type of story might be there. So we have previously actually shown that this network is active when reading stories versus rest. This is a very indirect way of showing this, and we are also showing that there are distinctive patterns for each story.
But I thought you said that at rest it's also active.
So when reading stories, there are different levels of activation.
Okay, so it's
right?
increased.
It gets increased, right? Any questions about those results, about the maps? Okay. So DMN is involved in language comprehension. There's a meta-analysis published where, for example, they have people read coherent and incoherent text, and they find that parts of the DMN get only active when people are reading coherent text. They do the same thing with, for example, people reading word level, sentence level, and paragraph level stories, and scrambling of these, and they show that the default mode DMN is only active when people are reading at the paragraph level. So essentially, the general idea is that DMN is important in comprehending global meaning that extends beyond word and sentence level. All right, I think I'm out of time, but just generally, again, so previous work has shown that DMN responds to abstract meanings. What we are showing, at least what we think we're showing, is that these patterns are unique to the stories. So it is actually not just becoming more active, it's encoding meaning of narratives. and that there might be significant interlanguage similarities in these activities.
Just a quick question about the substructure of the DMN and obviously your whole talk is really based upon being able to differentiate between different signals.
Right.
And so you showed us a global aggregate representation of how that system activates in some way. And you did already some investigation on the stories and characterizing the features of the stories in terms of their salience and importance and different aspects of them. Are you able to then infer from the structure of the stories and the structure of the data in the brain scans? Are you able to actually
That's a very good question.
structure within the DMN? I mean,
Right.
representational ideas of how people see themselves, things like that.
Right, so based on the values, based on the things that we talked about when we're collecting the stories, right? Evocativeness, that sort of stuff. We haven't done that, but that's a very good question.
It's very interesting.
Anything else?
Do you exclude visual cortex from the analysis typically?
We don't, no, but the visual cortex, if it's active for all these stories, then it's not important.
Oh, the searchlight
Classify that.
doesn't reveal it.
Right.
Sort of related-ish follow-up. Is there some kind of, out there in neuroscience, experiment that like, you know, tests to make sure that the brain actually like is monitoring thought? Something where like you get 100% classification of like all white versus all black light or something like that?
They do that with the visual cortex.
With the
So
visual cortex,
classification of the
clearly.
visual cortex is usually very good. So if you have people looking at, as you were saying,
Yeah.
like concrete categories,
Yeah.
then they can do that.
But there's nothing in the
Not in the other, so in the other, if you look at MVPA results in the other parts of the brain, the best classification result that you can get is in the 70s.
And what is that on? What kind of thing?
It might be auditory.
So it's like the brain analog.
I'm still trying to get an intuition about this. So you were talking, you're getting these 200,000 voxels from one fMRI scan. So if I project that onto 2D, that's about 500 by 500 pixels of a black and white picture, basically, where I get a gray level for each voxel. And then the classification task is, given one of those pictures taken from one of the participants, can I predict? So it's just one picture. From that, I predict which story they were reading. So it's sort of an image classification task, if you will,
If you wanna
on a
look at it
very
that
low
way.
resolution image. So and there was no temporal
There's
sequence.
no temporal, no, we're summing over, so we have 3 scans per story, but we're summing over that.
So that's still obviously sort of kind of intuitively extremely coarse grained. You know, when I read the title of the talk about neuro-semantic representation, I was hoping for
So see
something.
actual neurons?
Well, maybe something a little bit more
Maybe in
fine-grained
30
than that.
years.
Yeah, so we're still talking about very large regions, basically.
Oh, yes.
Yeah.
I mean, the best that we can do depends on the resolution of the fMRI. If the fMRI cannot give us anything more than 3 by 3 by 3, then that's the resolution of our picture, right? So we can't do anything there.
You know, no, I mean, it's not a criticism. I'm just sort of trying to get to, you know.
So I'm collaborating with the lab at UCLA that what they're doing is that they open up the skull of rats, right? And they put a camera on the skull, and they have the rats perform some tasks. The camera is high resolution enough that it can pick up activity of individual neurons. But unfortunately, I don't think we can open up the skull of humans and do that.
Is there any way sort of similar to, say, what they do in tomography, where you sort of take different slices from different angles, and then by some convolution combination of them?
That's what we do here. So this is the resolution that we're getting here is combination of various different
Already,
images.
okay.
Yeah. John? No?
Did you notice anything about the types of stories that were able to be well distinguished? Or?
That's a good question. It was asked before. We couldn't. No. Right.
Really nice work on the concept at the end. So for me, the most interesting thing is the second point here, because of what hypothesis it disproves.
Right.
So you might imagine that the default mode network is like this kind of CPU powerhouse, a buffer, maybe a memory buffer, something like that, and it's being used, recruited when doing envisionment or thinking about storage spaces and whatnot. But we seem to be saying here that it's actually much more semantically differentiated.
Right.
It's not resource to be used by the brain, but rather encoding.
Exactly, right. And showing that this is culturally irrelevant, right? So it's not that, for example, we are mostly self-focused, and that's why we're giving activity more in that region.
Exactly.
This is just a region that is actively representing these abstract meanings.
Yeah, how do you know that they were focusing, on the stories and not saying, how do I can't wait to get out of here, the story's boring.
We don't.
Okay.
Right. We don't. I mean, this is similar to any psych study that you do. So if you give questionnaires to participants, you have the same problem. You don't know if they're really thinking about the questions.
Did you
So
give them questionnaires at the end?
afterwards,
Okay.
right? But it's all about trying to get sort of similar signals across participants.
Is there any difference between the species between a man and a woman having the patterns? or-
No, there was no gender differences.
Okay.
So the cost of this is still, very high, $2,000. So what's been the tendency of the fMRI for this type of studies? Is it getting cheaper? So let's say in a couple of years, it might be just a fraction of the cost, or this is basically.
Andrew actually would probably know better about these costs than I do because he was the PI of the project.
I think we're 4 times more expensive than most places. So.
Yeah, we just spent millions of dollars upgrading the scanner at USC, and essentially these costs go to make us have the best state-of-the-art scanner. So we are expensive. For regular scans, I would say that it's think about it as around $1,000 per hour. These experiments took about 2 hours.
I think the question is if this is low in trend. When I talk to people who does fMRIs, I think not. These things are expensive. It's not like computers that are going to get cheaper next year. This seems to be like, the guy operating the scanner, the scanner itself. There seems to be something pushing the cost down very, very quickly.
Right. And it's not that we have the state-of-the-art. We have cameras that we can put inside people's skulls and get.
That will be cheaper.
So everything gets better, right?
You can get better, but not cheaper.
Exactly.
Well, do you think you could detect an effect with something lower resolution like EEG?
That was a question that I think he asked of whether, for example, we can distort some of this data and still try to get some of that, right?
Yeah, I just meant to do it all cheap.
Yeah.
So the third point there, it says there is significant interlanguage similarity in the patterns of activity in the DMF for each story. That sort of means to me that for each story you can sort of distinguish the activity that you see for each story. That sort of means to me, to say it again, that if you look at the pattern, that you are able to distinguish it much better than perhaps the regression method that you use to analyze it. Is there something about that?
If you are a type of human being that can look at 212,000 data points and distinguish those patterns from each other, then yes.
So this is just based on your analysis?
Right.
But, okay. But it says, to me, I'm probably getting this wrong here, but so if there is a interlanguage similarity of patterns for each single story, does that not mean that you're able to distinguish each story from each other story very well?
So that was the whole point of the talk, right?
Yeah, but you only had a very small amount of difference to random classification.
Right, we had 40 stories, so our claim is limited to those 40 stories, but we can't obviously test this on every story.
I know, but even for those 40 stories, you didn't get 100%. You had like 50%, which
we
was
can do this better than chance.
Better than chance.
Right. If we're doing this better than chance, if it's significant, then there is probably significant differences in the patterns of representation.
60%, right? That's
60%.
well better than chance. And you said 70 is the upper limit, so
Right.
halfway there. That's not bad.
70 is the upper limit?
From the multivoxel pattern analysis, not including the visual cortex, the best that I've seen are
That you've seen.
It's like a CCD, basically.
Right.
This may be a somewhat silly question, but because your beam search is basically searching the whole space for the most significant sets of voxels that are doing that. I was wondering if there's any way of distinguishing between different regions that are being activated. Like maybe doing some kind of feature ablation, like if you remove some of the voxels from your set according to some theory. Let's say we'll remove the PFC and see if we can see how.
And this is the sphere itself is very small, so it moves all across the brain, right? And the analysis is only limited to that sphere. So for the majority of the analysis, the PMC is not included, right? It gets into the PMC, small portion of the PMC, right? It looks at that, and then, so we are doing that. We are, in the searchlight analysis, as you're saying in the view analysis, that's exactly what we're doing. Okay, thank you so much, guys. And then the other two. There are two passages. Does that make sense?
Yeah. And all the previous stuff, was that always binary classification?
It's usually binary classification.
Okay.
Yeah.
Like tools versus animals?
Exactly.
Okay.
Right.
Not 1 for 4.
Right. Right. And it's usually classification, right? Generally. So does the searchlight analysis make sense, though? So they move around the brain, every voxel, and they try to do, out of all the features that they had in their analysis, which one is predictive of that story at that time. Okay? And they get something like this. Again, some of this makes sense. So for visual, we have the occipital lobe, right? For syntax, we have part of language areas that are known to be related to syntax, etc. Okay? There have also been work looking at interlanguage decoding. So if we have bilingual participants, right? If we know the neural activity for one language, can we predict the neural activity in the other language? Okay? So in this particular experiment, they used one of the features out of all the features that that were listed in the previous slide to see whether that feature is predictive of the activity of that voxel. Okay? And they did this for the whole brain.
What does this 74% accuracy mean?
It means that, good question. So it means that if they, I'm going to explain this method when I'm explaining our study, but very high level. So if they predict one particular activity, right, and they have two different segments. So they make two different predictions, and they have the real activity, right? And if the distance between the real activity, the predictive activity of the two, are greater than the distance of the other combination. Does that make sense?
So is the non-real one is randomly drawn usually?
What do you mean?
You said that the two things you're comparing to versus the predicted thing, right? One thing is the true thing, and the other thing is the not true thing.
No, so it's the other one. So there are two passages that are left out.
Oh, two passages.
Right?
Gotcha.
So it's the predictive, the passage,
Yeah.
right? So within each fMRI image, you have 4 words, okay? And the activity the activity in the fMRI approximately lasts for about 8 seconds. So in their predictive model, they basically used predicted activity from 4 time points before in order to predict the last time point. And the features that they had were discourse features, visual features, syntactic features, so whatever they can get from the story was included as part of the features that went into the analysis. And essentially it was a combination of all these features, and they included these features throughout time, so through 4 time points before, and they were able to make predictions about passages. So these were the type of passages, 16 words, and they were able to achieve 74% accuracy. They also did searchlight analysis, which is interesting. So for every voxel in the brain, every 5 by 5 voxel in the brain, they had Dutch and English, and they read names of animals in 2 different languages, in either Dutch or English. Okay? And again, they were able to do this. They were able to make these predictions across both within language predictions and across language prediction. And the activity that they find is in the region that's in the anterior temporal lobe that the 1996 Damasio paper doing lesion studies indicated that this might actually be a semantic hub. So, cool.
All right, so now I'm going to talk about our work. Our work is on neurosemantic representations of stories. The general goal is to see whether we can, so the general goal is to investigate the neural representations of narratives across 3 different languages. There are 2 main questions that we try to answer. One, are there predictable patterns in neurosemantic representations of narratives? And if so, can these predictable patterns be used to distinguish narratives based on fMRI data? The second question is that, so there were several interesting findings. 2, again, that I just explained, I think are very important, are that before a new word is read, they show that the brain activity is well predicted by the latent representation in the neural network that's representing the context. And after the word is read, again, the correlation still holds with the prediction of the word. This is the last paper that I'm going to try to explain before I get to the other part of the talk. This is a 2004 +1 paper by the same group, essentially, Leila Wahbi and Tom Mitchell. And here they try to predict activity. It's not really stories, it's passages of Harry Potter. And the paradigm that they have is that inside the fMRI, every word is presented half a second apart. So they see Harry had never believed within 2 seconds. Okay? And it takes 2 seconds to get an fMRI image.